Okay, low-rise jeans. Just hearing those words again, it's like instant flashbacks, right? I swear, some trends are best left in the past. But hey, that's why we're here. We're going beyond those early 2000s outfits, those looks we all remember, or try to forget.
It's true, some things are better left behind.
Get ready to really unpack this era because there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. We're talking about the bigger picture of 2000s fashion, what really shaped the way we dressed back then.
It really is fascinating when you think about it. The 2000s were kind of like this perfect storm of cultural shifts all happening at once. The internet was exploding, globalization was changing how we connected with the world, social media was just starting to take hold, and of course all of that is reflected in the fashion of the time.
It's like a time capsule, right? And to really unpack this era, we're turning to an academic source because, well, who doesn't love a little intellectual twist on their fashion history?
Always good to have a little substance with our style, right?
Exactly.
What I find so interesting about this piece is that it highlights this really intriguing tension that was happening in 2000s fashion. You have this unstoppable rise of fast fashion. I mean, it was everywhere.
It was like the floodgates opened and suddenly everyone had access to trendy clothes at prices that seemed almost too good to be true.
Exactly. But then on the flip side, you also had this huge resurgence of vintage. Like we were craving something with a bit more soul, a connection to the past.
It's like we were trying to find that balance between keeping up with the latest trends, but also wanting something with a little more meaning, a little more history.
Absolutely. And that push and pull between the new and the old, the fast and the, let's say, curated, it really defined the fashion of the 2000s in a lot of ways.
And let's be real, when it came to fast fashion, it was hard to resist. I mean, Zara, H&M, Forever 21, they completely changed the game.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Suddenly you didn't have to spend a fortune to dress like your favorite celebrity or, at least try to.
It was all about instant gratification. See a trend you like? Boom, it's in your closet a week later.
Exactly. But looking back, there was a bit of a trade-off, wasn't there? Fast fashion completely changed the pace of the industry. Clothes were cheaper, yes, but the trends changed even faster.
It was like this constant cycle of buying, wearing something once or twice, and then it felt, well, dated.
It really made people start to question, what's the real cost of all this cheap clothing, both ethically and in terms of the environmental impact? And those are questions that are still so relevant today.
It's true. We were starting to see the cracks in that fast fashion facade. But speaking of things that were almost too good to be true, can we talk about the comeback of vintage? I mean, 60s, 70s, and 80s styles, they were back in a big way. We're talking low-rise jeans, though maybe we can leave those in the past this time around. Leather jackets, those flowy boho dresses.
And it wasn't just about individual style either. Some of the biggest designers were taking inspiration from vintage.
Oh, totally. I mean, Marc Jacobs, Miuccia Prada, Anna Sui, they were all reinterpreting vintage looks for a new generation. And it worked.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about how the internet played a role in all of this. Suddenly, with platforms like eBay, you could find those unique vintage treasures without ever leaving your house.
It was like thrifting went digital.
Exactly. And that really added to the appeal. It wasn't just about the clothes. It was the thrill of the hunt, finding those one-of-a-kind pieces that told a story.
So we've got fast fashion blowing up, vintage making a comeback, and now we've got to talk about the designers who really defined the 2000s. Because let's be real, this decade was a breeding ground for some serious fashion icons.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about some of the biggest names in fashion history designers who pushed boundaries, sparked controversy, and created some of the most memorable collections of all time.
I'm talking about those designers whose names you knew even if you didn't follow fashion.
Exactly. Like Alexander McQueen, his shows were legendary. They were theatrical, often provocative, and he wasn't afraid to challenge traditional notions of beauty.
He was a true visionary. And then you had John Galliano, whose time at Dior was like something out of a fairy tale. The clothes were just incredible. So romantic, so dramatic.
And let's not forget about Nicolas Ghesquière, Balenciaga. He brought this really cool architectural element to his designs. It was almost futuristic.
He really shook things up. But you know what's interesting? While all of this was happening, you also had this wave of minimalism coming through.
Oh, absolutely. It was like this counter movement to all the extravagance.
Right. And we can't talk about minimalist fashion without mentioning Phoebe Philo. Her influence on women's wear, first at Chloe and then at Celine, it was huge.
It was all about clean lines, beautiful fabrics, and that kind of effortlessly chic look that everyone wanted.
It was understated luxury at its finest. But it wasn't just women's wear. Raf Simons was making waves in menswear, and eventually women's wear too, with his really modern minimalist approach.
His designs were so clean, so sharp, and they really influenced how men dressed in the 2000s. And let's not forget that there were also some amazing rising stars during this time, designers who were just starting to make their mark on the fashion world.
Like who? Give us the scoop.
Well, there was Christopher Kane, for example. He was known for his really innovative use of fabrics and embellishments. His designs were always unexpected, always interesting.
He wasn't afraid to take risks, that's for sure. And then you have the Malevi sisters, the design duo behind Rodarte, which was one of the most talked about brands of the late 2000s.
Their designs were so romantic and feminine, but with this edgy twist. They weren't afraid to experiment with different textures, and they really embraced this kind of handcrafted feel in their work. It was really unique.
Okay, so we've covered the rise of fast fashion, the resurgence of vintage, and the incredible designers who defined the era. But we can't wrap up this deep dive without talking about some of the actual trends that made 2000s fashion so, well, memorable. And let's be real, some of them were a little questionable. I mean, we've all got some fashion regrets from that era, right?
Oh, absolutely. The 2000s were a time of bold experimentation. And let's just say some experiments were more successful than others.
Where do we even begin? The early 2000s obsession with all things shiny and blinged out?
It was like more was always more, wasn't it? Think crop tops, low-rise jeans, those velour tracksuits that seemed to be everywhere.
Can we all agree to never bring back the dresses over jeans trend, though? Please.
I think we can safely retire that one, yes. But then, of course, you have the complete opposite end of the spectrum, the boho-chic look. It was all about flowy skirts, peasant tops, ethnic-inspired accessories. That free-spirited, festival-ready vibe was huge.
Okay, now that's a trend I can get behind. It was all about comfort and ease with a touch of bohemian flair. What's not to love?
Right, and then you had the rise of the emo and scene kids with their black skinny jeans, band tees, and that very specific straightened hair with the long side bangs.
And the hipsters. We can't forget about the hipsters with their vintage finds, thick-rimmed glasses, and ironic t-shirts. Every subculture had its own distinct look, its own uniform, in a way.
Absolutely, and you could spot them a mile away. But, for all the different subcultures and micro-trends, there was this one massive factor that was starting to influence everything during this decade, the internet.
The internet was like this seismic shift, not just in fashion, but in everything. And it was happening so fast.
It really was. Think about it. We were going from fashion being this thing dictated by magazines and designers to suddenly anyone with an internet connection could share their style, their opinions, their own unique take on fashion.
And people were listening.
It was like this whole new world of fashion was opening up, and it was exciting.
And it wasn't just about people sharing their outfits. This was also the rise of fashion blogs. Suddenly you had people like Susie Bovell, Brian Campbell, and these were just regular people with really good taste and strong opinions, and they were shaking things up.
They were like, I'm going to tell you what I think about this.
Yeah. And people really responded to that. It felt more authentic,
Oh, totally. Because it wasn't just about what was on the runway anymore. It was about how real people were interpreting those trends, how they were putting their own spin on things.
Yeah.
It made fashion feel more accessible, more relatable.
Absolutely. It was like, okay, I can't afford that designer dress, but I can totally recreate the vibe with some vintage finds and a little DIY.
Right. And let's not forget about the rise of online shopping. That was huge.
Game changer. Platforms like Net-a-Porter, ASOS, they completely changed the game. Suddenly, you could buy clothes online from practically anywhere in the world.
You didn't have to live in a big city to have access to the latest trends anymore. It really did democratize fashion in a lot of ways. Although, I'll admit, it probably also led to a few impulse purchases that I'm not exactly proud of.
Oh, I think we've all been there. The ease of online shopping can be dangerous. Speaking of dangerous for our wallets, at least, can we talk about some of the brands that really defined the 2000s? Because we had some major players.
Oh, yeah. There were some brands that really captured the spirit of the time. If we're talking luxury, you can't forget about Marc Jacobs at Louis Vuitton. I mean, he completely transformed that brand, made it cool again.
He really did. He wasn't afraid to take risks, and it paid off.
Totally. And then you had Karl Lagerfeld at Chanel, keeping that brand relevant, iconic, and desirable season after season.
And the Gucci revival under Tom Ford, then Frida Giannini, talk about a power move.
Those were some statement pieces. But while all this was happening in the luxury world, there was this whole other side of fashion that was blowing up, streetwear. And it was challenging those traditional luxury brands in a big way.
Absolutely. Streetwear was having a moment, and it wasn't just about the clothes. It was about the culture, the
It
attitude.
was about being part of something, right?
Totally. Like Supreme, they went from this niche skate shop in New York to a global phenomenon.
People were obsessed, standing in line for hours just to get their hands on a T-shirt.
It was crazy. And then you had Bathing Ape, or BAPE, as everyone called it.
Those graphics were everywhere. It was all about being bold, being seen.
And we can't forget about Ed Hardy. Whether you loved it or hated it, you have to admit those tattoo-inspired designs were everywhere in the mid-2000s.
Yeah, you couldn't escape them. It was like peak 2000s fashion in a nutshell.
Oh, for sure. But Ed Hardy wasn't the only one bringing the bold. Sportswear was having a major fashion moment, too. I mean, Nike was still killing it, of course, always innovating. Remember when Nike came out?
Oh, yeah. 2006, right. That was a big deal. Suddenly, everyone was tracking their runs, their workouts. It was like the beginning of the fitness tracker craze.
Right. It's crazy how much things have changed even since then. But it wasn't just Nike. Adidas was really stepping up its game, too, especially through collaborations like Y3 with Yohji Yamamoto.
They really blurred those lines between sportswear and high fashion.
Which brings us to arguably one of the most fun parts of any decade, the style icons. The people who just embodied the look, the attitude of the time, and the 2000s did not disappoint.
Oh, no, not at all.
We had Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie, the queens of Y2K fashion. They were everywhere, and they always looked, well, exactly how you'd expect.
Blinged out.
It was all about the glitz and the glam. But then you had Sienna Miller, who was the complete opposite. She was boho-chic personified.
Effortlessly cool.
Mixing vintage with designer, always looking so effortless and chic. She made everyone want to raid their local thrift store.
And you can't forget about Kate Moss, already a fashion icon, but her influence in the 2000s was undeniable, especially with those Topshop collaborations.
Everyone wanted to dress like Kate Moss. And then there was Chloe Sevigny, who was always so edgy, so ahead of the curve. She always had that cool, effortless downtown New York vibe.
She wasn't afraid to take risks, that's for sure. And it's funny because those were some of the biggest names in fashion, but you also had musicians really coming into their own as style icons during this time. Britney Spears' whole evolution from pop princess to...
Well,
Riddle.
let's just say she went through a phase. But even that became iconic.
Exactly. And Gwen Stefani. She really embraced her own unique style, both on stage and off. And then she launched her own fashion line, LAMB.
Which I have to say was actually really cool. It wasn't just some celebrity vanity project. It had its own distinct aesthetic. And you can't talk about musicians who made a statement with fashion without mentioning Lady Gaga. I mean, she exploded onto the scene towards the end of the decade, and she completely changed the game.
Her outfits were like performance art.
They were. She wasn't afraid to be outrageous, to push boundaries.
And it worked. She really got people talking. But you know what I find really interesting? It wasn't just musicians and actors who were becoming style icons. Even royals and politicians were getting in on the action. Michelle Obama, for example, was a fashion force during her time as First Lady. She really embraced fashion as a form of self-expression, and she wasn't afraid to experiment.
I love that she championed up-and-coming designers, too. She really brought attention to some lesser-known names.
She did. And then, of course, there's Kate Middleton. She kind of single-handedly brought fascinators back into style.
Who'd thought? It's amazing how she can make even the most traditional pieces feel modern and fresh.
She's got that classic timeless elegance.
She does. You know, it's amazing to see how much influence those style icons had on the everyday person. But as we wrap up our little trip back to the 2000s, what are some of the big takeaways here? When we think about 2000s fashion, what's the lasting impact? What's still shaping how we dress today?
Well, I think you have to start with fast fashion, right? And that's a big one.
It's the elephant in the room, isn't it? It completely changed how we shop for clothes, how we think about clothes.
And it brought up all these really important questions about sustainability, about the true cost of cheap clothing.
Yeah.
Questions that, honestly, we're still grappling with today.
We are. And it's interesting because while fast fashion was exploding, you also had this resurgence of vintage happening at the same time. It's like people were craving something with a bit more soul, a little more individuality.
Totally.
Yeah.
And vintage has really stood the test of time, hasn't it? It's not just a trend anymore. It's a whole mindset.
Absolutely. It's about finding those one-of-a-kind pieces, giving pre-loved clothes a new life. It's more sustainable. It's more unique. And it's a way to express your own personal style. But we can't forget about the other huge factor that shaped 2000s fashion, the internet.
It really did change everything, didn't it?
It's crazy to think about how much the internet evolved in just that one decade. We went from dial-up and waiting for fashion magazines to hit newsstands, to instant access to runway shows, style inspiration from all over the world.
And the ability to shop for anything, anytime.
It's almost overwhelming. But it made fashion less about what some magazine editor told you to wear and more about finding your own voice, your own style.
It was the beginning of influencer culture, the rise of online shopping, and it completely changed how we consume fashion.
It really did. It's like we were all just figuring it out as we went along, weren't we?
We were. It was a time of experimentation, both in terms of style and technology.
And some of those experiments worked better than others. But hey, that's fashion. It's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be expressive. And sometimes it's a little cringeworthy looking back, but that's all part of the story, right?
Exactly. And I think that's what's so fascinating about fashion. It's always a reflection of the time. It tells a story about who we are, what we value, what we aspire to.
It's like that saying, fashion is a language. And the 2000s had a lot to say. But as we wrap up this deep dive, it makes you wonder, what will our fashion legacy be? What will people say about the way we dressed 20 years from now?
Right. I mean, will athleisure go down in history as a trend? Or will it become a way of life?
I need answers.
I know. It's the ultimate fashion mystery.
Only time will tell. Well, on that note, we're wrapping up this deep dive into the wild world of 2000s fashion. We hope you enjoyed this little blast from the past. Maybe it even inspired you to dig out some of those old treasures from the back of your closet.
Or maybe not.
Either way, we had a blast revisiting this iconic era. And who knows, maybe some of those 2000s trends deserve a second chance. Or maybe not. We'll leave that up to you to decide.
Some things are better left in the past.
Until next time.